I guess this is, for me at least, this is my last day. So hopefully I'll try and keep the energy high, and again try and get you guys motivated about preconfs and why there is a significant argument for their economic optimality. So the talk outline, I'm going to present the most popular preconf protocol flavors, at least the classifications that we've identified. We're going to identify revenue models for each, and with these models, we're going to convince you that preconfs are inevitable, that the preconfirmations will happen, and to do that, we're going to demonstrate that preconfs are economically viable. And given that the preconfs are going to happen, we then discuss the trade-offs that these protocols will bring just beyond the revenue. So a quick preconfirmation primer, just in case anybody doesn't know. So with preconfirmations, we obviously, with this proposer monopoly that exists, we have a proposer 12 seconds ahead of the time, or the proposers for the next 32 slots in Ethereum are known ahead of time, and then for the time before they have to propose a block, they can sign a promise to a user that they will include or execute a specific transaction in a specific manner, producing a specific state. So that's a preconfirmation. And so we've been, like, for some people in the room and people who might be watching the video afterwards, we've been in these preconfirmation sequencing chats for the last year, and people sort of believe that preconfirmations will happen, and they've felt it in their bones for a while, but we haven't really been able to put our finger on why they're going to happen, or like why the proposers are actually going to run this protocol, and that's going to be the key for preconfirmations to actually exist. So the arguments that have been posed are they're a UX necessity to compete with these alt L1s and side chains, like Solana is producing blocks 400 milliseconds, or updates every 400 milliseconds. Ethereum is every 12 seconds. That just isn't good enough. We also have this pretty strong understanding that preconfirmations will help composability. That, like, the quicker we can update the state, the quicker we can basically send that state to some other blockchain or some other rollup, and then allow that rollup to itself act on that state, and again, this cycle can just be repeated, allowing for composability, some form of composability. And then we also have this additional thing, which maybe hasn't been discussed as much, but which I guess people sort of assume is that these preconfirmations will benefit proposers economically. And this is work that we proposed to the Lido Foundation, and we recently got accepted. So we decided to look specifically at, like, some of these preconfirmation protocols and analyze their economic viability. Okay, so to show you that these preconfirmations are economically viable, or at least to model their revenue, we're going to, first of all, basically need to introduce a couple of housekeeping things. So Ethereum progresses in slots, but then these preconfirmation protocols are going to progress in sub-slots, something within the slots that are sort of defined within Ethereum. And the entities that we're interested in are proposers, the proposers we know from Ethereum, but then we're going to have this concept of active proposers, who are the people who actually own the rights. So they're not necessarily the people who are defined within the Ethereum protocol, but the people that have been given the rights to propose, maybe by the proposer, the original Ethereum proposer themselves, so the active proposer. The relayer, who we know runs the auctions, enforces fair exchange, the relayers that exist within MEV-Boost as an example, and then builders, the ones that are building the blocks, or potentially just searchers who are building bundles. So these are the three entities that we're going to be very interested in when we're discussing preconfirmations. So the classifications that we're going to be looking at today are inclusion-only preconfs, so things like Bolt and ETH gas, like, okay, I will include this thing, or I'll include this sub-block or this entire block for you. Then we're going to look at execution preconfs. So these within this execution preconf space, we've proposed to have independent subset auctions, which I'll define properly in the next slide, or in a couple of slides. And the examples of these are Jitto and OP Superchain. We also have Polygon Proof of Stake, where we have one proposer who is producing multiple blocks or sub-blocks in a row. And these guys are committing to running basically independent auctions among builders, each block or sub-block that they control, which is a little bit unusual, but it is the protocols that they're running, and they're definitely a significant class of preconfirmation protocol. Given that we have independent subset auctions, we also introduced dependent subset auctions, which are slightly more complex, but basically the proposer is no longer agreeing to run an auction to build everything. They're being very selective about what can be built and setting very specific reserve prices for potentially each transaction that comes in. And then a slight variation of this, which isn't a proposer offered preconfirmation, is the builder signing for preconfs. So I included this on the plane over here to Bangkok, and again, this is definitely an independent class of preconfirmation protocol, and MEV-Commit is the prime example of this. So the builders are signing the preconfs, and then the builders are later participating in a MEV-Boost auction to get selected by the proposer. So a different type of guarantee than a proposer offered preconf. Independent subslot auctions, so I've already given sort of the intuition, but so at each subslot, the proposer is running an auction among a set of builders, and the key assumption here is that the proposer is low resource, naive, doesn't know how to do this themselves, so they have to go to the market and run an auction or get the relayer to run an auction for them. But they're able to sign for blocks arbitrarily fast. So this is going to be the independent subslot auction, which we're sort of going to base the first part of our analysis on. And again, I mentioned the examples of this already. And yeah, they're well used in production, but their revenue and the revenue effects that they would have on a proposer in Ethereum maybe aren't so well understood. And then again, I introduced it, I sort of mentioned already, this dependent subslot auction. So to describe this, we have an active proposer. So each auction, so again, each subslot, they're going to run an auction. Same way that we were doing it independent subslot auctions, but this time they're going to sell the right to build a subblock at that subslot, but also give the proposer rights to the person who wins the auction. So it started the first subslot, the Ethereum proposer is the active proposer. But then, again, the person who wins each auction will then take over active proposer rights, and then they have the ability to themselves participate in each auction. And these active proposer rights may change hands throughout the Ethereum slot. And then at the end of the last subslot, all of these subblocks are merged in the order that they were built and proposed as the Ethereum block. And the example of this, it's not a perfect example, but again, I mentioned already, it's like this gateway with a pair preconf oracle. They're looking at each individual update and saying, is this preconf paying enough money to me to include it? So it's quite an intensive role, and it's definitely something that it's sort of in line with this gateway design that Justin maybe has discussed, but hasn't properly been defined. So yeah, just the high level, like everything that I've described already is just put up here. So with the independent subslot auction, the proposer doesn't change, they're just running auctions, and the person who wins the auction gets to build the block, and then the proposer receives the revenue from that subslot. In the dependent subslot auctions, Pete, the proposer of the Ethereum block, is the first proposer, but then when Bob wins the subslot auction, Bob builds some sort of a sub block. They can put whatever they want in there, but then they gain the right to be the active proposer in the next sub block. So what Bob is paying Pete is the value that they attribute to the sub block that they're building, but also to the expected revenue that the remaining subslots achieve. So this slight change, or it's a pretty significant change, but this slight change makes Bob not just try to maximize the value of their subblock, but maximize the value of the entire slot, because in the next subblock, they're going to be gaining the revenue of the remaining subslot auctions in expectancy. So Bob is trying to choose a subblock that will maximize the revenue of the entire, the value of the entire block for the Ethereum slot. So it's a different building process, or a different way of thinking about what I'm trying to do. Whereas in the first auction, Bob is just trying to, in independent auctions, Bob is trying to maximize the value right here, right now, of all opportunities that exist. So it's a different way of thinking about building. Okay, to analyze these, we're going to look at MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs, ISSAs, this independent subslot auction, DSSAs, dependent, MEV-Commit, and we're going to derive novel results about the expected rewards without preconfirmation tips. All right, so we're going to remove the preconfirmation tips from our analysis, and then describe that, okay, well, if we have preconfs, we then expect tips to happen, and then these tips will only add on or potentially replace some of the revenue that running these protocols induces. And then for each, we're going to compare it to MEV-Boost, because that's a pretty good standard, and that's the decision that the first proposers will have to make. Do I want to run MEV-Boost, or will I run one of these preconf protocols? Okay, so the first result that we have for MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs is relatively straightforward. It's the expected revenue of MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs is greater than or equal to the expected revenue from MEV-Boost. And maybe you have your own intuition why this is true, but basically signing no inclusion preconfs is an inclusion preconf strategy. So if you do no preconfs in every single subblock, that's equivalent to running MEV-Boost at the end. So choosing to include or choosing to preconf any inclusion preconf as a rational proposer must increase your revenue and expectancy. So basically, we have this very simple result that just it's a week bound on the revenue of MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs compared to the revenue with MEV-Boost. But again, with tips, we're going to this greater than or equal to should become greater, and MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs is probably going to be a viable option for preconfing. To go beyond this sort of simple MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs, we decided to look then at for ISSs, we are splitting the MEV-Boost, the Ethereum slot into subslots. So we wanted to analyze, or we wanted to maybe estimate what we expected the current proposed rewards to do when we introduce subslots. And to do that, we decided to look at each type of MEV or type of MEV strategy that's taking place in an Ethereum block. And this was the distribution of the rewards that were being paid to proposers based on strategy. So forgetting about this dark blue slot for a second, we have atomic arbitrage, just-in-time sandwiching, sex-dex arbitrage, sandwiching, normal sandwiching, and then complex strategies, which are like NFT mints or like combinations of various parts of the other segments. And then, so all of these things, we are going to try and come up with a model for how the value of these pieces of our MEV strategies will change as we go from t equal to 0 to t equal to 12. And yeah, basically that's going to help us to derive a model or some sort of estimation for what we expect the addition of subslots to do for proposed rewards. And then this remainder piece is approximately, we're not exactly sure, but we think it's basically down to user priority fees. So just the random priority fees that users pay to get included in a block. So this blue chunk won't change, and you'll see later on in our sort of final model that this blue chunk will make up the majority of expected rewards for proposers when they offer preconfs without inclusion tips. Okay, so this first reward, basically all of this analysis was inspired by Milionis et al. and Alex Neslobin, who's here today, which basically we had this pretty novel result that showed that sex-dex MEV was growing super linearly with time. So we basically had the graph that you see here is exponential, but we basically had this super linear graph for sex-dex arbitrage, but then that didn't necessarily include the fees that were being paid. So we decided to model sex-dex arbitrage as growing with respect to t to the power of 3/2. And then when we introduce subslots, basically we start from subslot 0, and then every time, so basically we allow our MEV to grow, and then every time it becomes greater than base fee, we expect a MEV searcher to execute that transaction, right? And then the difference between the fee and the value of the opportunity at that time will be the amount that the proposer captures, and then the value will reset to 0 again. Like, it's a simplified model, but that's what we decided to do. And basically, what we can see here is that as we increase the number of subslots, the number of splits is just the number of subslots, basically the amount of rewards the proposer is receiving is tending towards 0, which is, again, maybe this was an intuition that you had yourself, but this is sort of what our model shows. So the analogy here is the sink and the MEV, that the MEV is coming from the tap and it's falling into the sink. And then every time it reaches the overflow point, the MEV is captured, and then it's supposed to be reset to 0. I know a tap wouldn't actually empty when it reaches the overflow point, but when it gets to that point, assume it just drops to 0. So that's basically how we're modeling these MEV opportunities as growing. Okay, and then so that was sex-dex. Sex-dex, we had this super linear growth, but for these other types of MEV strategies, we had to come up with something a bit more general because we had no real accurate model for modeling how the value was growing. So we just decided to apply a Poisson, but I'm sure people will disagree with that. There was a couple of disagreements already, but to be honest, this is more about showing when you have this sort of random arrival, we basically with subslots, you don't give these MEV strategies enough time to grow, and by adding continuous updates through subslots, the proposer revenue will decrease and tend towards something, not necessarily 0, but something towards 0. So we basically come up with this equilibrium point using our assumptions that estimate the proposer loss for introducing sub-block auctions to tend towards a loss of 74%, with that 25%, 26% being the sort of the normal user priority fees that are just being paid for inclusion in a block. because those things won't change with time. Like users will still pay randomly to get included in an Ethereum block. Okay, so that was the ISSAs. For DSSAs, we again go back to the more formal methods, and DSSAs incentivize the builder to choose a subblock that maximizes the total expected value of the remaining subslots. So this was the intuition that I was trying to share earlier. So the winning builder, like what they're buying is they're buying the value of the subblock that they're building, but also the expected value of the remaining subslots. So they're trying to maximize the sum of both of those things, and basically maximizing this is equivalent to maximizing that sum is equivalent to maximizing the expected value of all of the remaining subslots. So for a proposer, basically this means, okay, I know this person, all the builders in this auction are trying to maximize the value of the maximize the expected value of the remaining subslots. One of those possible strategies is including no transactions, which is equivalent to MEV-Boost. So as a proposer, the expected revenue of this auction, this subslot auction, of this DSSA, must be greater than or equal to running MEV-Boost. Okay, so the intuition then, some more intuition. Again, I've tried to add a few pieces of intuition because I gave this presentation earlier in the week and I saw a lot of empty expressions. So basically with the ISSAs, the builders that are winning the auction are maximizing the value of the subblocks at each subslot. So without necessarily considering the maximum possible value that can be captured, or maximum value in expectancy that can be captured by basically building a subblock with that in mind. They're constantly just trying to maximize the value right here, right now. So every time they build a block, they actually reduce the maximum expected value of the entire Ethereum slot, while DSSAs actually keep that maximum there. Now again, it's not going to be a straight line throughout the subslot. It's going to change with respect throughout the slot. It's going to change when new pieces of information arise. But every time you build a subblock, or the subblock is sold in an independent subslot auction, the maximum expected value of the slot will decrease, in line with those that exponential decay curve that we had in the simulation results. Okay, so that's the revenue of the MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs, which I showed was greater than or equal to the revenue of MEV-Boost. We have the ISSAs, which are bad, like in some general sense. Like we had the 75% drop in rewards, and then we had DSSAs, which I didn't present the result here, but DSSAs we can show are better than any of the other three or any of the other four protocols combined. So basically we have DSSAs within those classifications are the optimal for the proposer in terms of maximizing revenue. And MEV-Commit is somewhere in between MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs and DSSAs. So, okay, ignoring the second row for a second, or second row for a minute, we then look at pricing ease, trust assumptions, spam prevention, and centralization. MEV-Boost is better than all of these other protocols in each of those rows. Again, this is not necessarily a science, but this is just a sort of looking at pricing ease. In pricing ease in MEV-Boost, you just have to, the builders are just trying to maximize the value of the subblock each time, or sorry, the entire block each time. With ISSAs, that's all they're doing as well. But then when it comes to DSSAs and MEV-Commit, you basically need this oracle to properly price every single update that you're trying to do, and should I update this or not. With MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs, the chain-bound guys and us as well have a approximation for how you should price an inclusion preconf. It's relatively straightforward, but still there is situations where you might not want to provide an inclusion preconf, so the pricing isn't as easy as MEV-Boost. So basically, MEV-Boost is better in almost all categories apart from revenue, right? But for a proposer, you might actually prefer this because you're scared about spam prevention, you're worried about centralization, or you don't like the trust assumptions of these other protocols. But the key difference here, and the key, again, unfortunately, the warm fuzzy part of this table is the user experience. So the user experience is going to be what's going to basically push the proposer towards preconfirmations. So in that sense, okay, the execution preconf protocols are like best for users, but MEV-Boost plus inclusion preconfs is potentially like a happy medium, and I'm going to discuss that now in a second. So proposers can increase their rewards through preconfs, more or less, like ISSAs aside, and even with ISSAs, if there is tips, we may be able to compensate for that loss of that I showed in the simulations. Basically, with this knowledge, we have to assume preconfs will happen, right? Proposers are rational. Maybe not every proposer, but like the majority of proposers will probably have to be rational eventually. So this is a paradigm that we need to prepare for, and so we need to design our protocols with that in mind. Yeah, basically, yeah, we've got tons of revenue flying around. What are we supposed to do against it? So some easy things, some starter pack updates that we can do, or some not necessarily updates. People are probably doing this already, but things that we can do, right? So inclusion preconfs now, execution preconfs later. So that seems like a way that we can test the water without really hurting our centralization and trust assumptions, and give proposers a taste of preconfs and see what they'll do in the long term. Oh, sorry, and then maybe sort of like provide a basis for execution preconfs and how to think about those in the future. Insist on open source and interoperable designs. This seems like an obvious one, but again, it's just something that we need to make sure we push for when we see people proposing preconfirmation protocols. And yeah, make sure that we have no vendor lock-in and ability to pivot if something bad happens. Implementations driven by research. Again, that's maybe just maybe like my own career prospect speaking, but like. Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we're designing our implementation, or we're basically implementing things that have been sort of rubber stamped by research, or at least that we understand the risks because of research. So fast implementation is good, optimized, well understood implementation is better. So then they're the easy ones, right? Then maybe the more advanced things that we can do, inclusion lists. So with some of these preconf protocols, we're probably going to end up in a situation as bad or potentially worse than current MEV-Boost, almost definitely worse, right? Because the pricing is going to be more complex. In those scenarios, in the current scenario, we've got two people building the majority of Ethereum blocks. With preconfs, we're potentially we're either going to reinforce that two, or we're going to basically narrow it down to one person. And even if there is one person building, we still need to make sure we have credibly neutral chain. So we basically need to be able to force include. Honest updates. So maybe inclusion lists are the medium version, and the hard version of this might be something related to Max's proposal for Braid. But again, how Braid and preconfs interact is a separate presentation. Okay, and then the hard version, I'll say that the hard thing that maybe we might have to do is introduce a tested proposer separation to help isolate the effects on proposers, right? So proposers, all of these inclusion preconf, all execution preconf protocols are all adding work on the already sort of overworked validator set if we want the validator set to be decentralized. So potentially we need to be introducing these tested proposer protocols to isolate the effects on the validator set. Keep the validator set for validating and credible neutrality and censor resistance, but and so basically keep the proposers for doing these high octane sort of very complicated protocols, especially if these preconf protocols are going to be the way forward. We better prepare for them, and the tested proposer separation would be one way to do this. And then, okay, so what others are there? So that's one of the hardest questions, right? It's like, okay, we have this train that's coming straight for us. We basically, how do we come up with solutions? And I guess the only way to do this is to keep talking, keep having these sort of events. And yeah, I guess experiment on testnets, experiment on L2s and base rollups, and then apply our learnings to L1. And yeah, we're working on this, at least some of the centralization stuff with PBS Foundation. Okay, so yeah, that's everything. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Connor. Can you explain again, how do you facilitate a dependent sub-slot auction?
Yeah, so we don't, but so the dependent sub-slot auctions is trying to approximate the scenario of having a single gateway. So having one, so I mentioned that, like, okay, MEV-Boost has two builders right now, and that the advanced preconfirmation solutions might just have one builder who can price everything, right? So in that one builder can price everything, or one builder has to price everything, they would effectively be winning their own sub-block. They would be winning their own DSSA every single time, right? And so yes, implementing a DSSA where you're actually transferring rights between different people is quite difficult, but the sort of the block building procedure for a single gateway should be approximately the same as in the DSSA example. So you've got one proposer, let's say a gateway, who is looking at all of the transactions that are coming in to see if they want to build a sub-block. And the sub-block that they choose will be a sub-block that maximizes the revenue of the entire slot. That's how a gateway will probably think about pricing execution pre-confirmations, if that makes sense.
Can I think of it as like a window of slots? It's like pricing like a bunch of slots together so that the builder will so each slots are dependent on each other and they can just execute with a execution pre-confirmation.
Yeah, like I think maybe the easiest way to think about, like, I guess the theory, like the reason why we're motivated to think about dependent subset auctions is probably just thinking about them as dependent pre-confirmations versus independent pre-confirmations. A dependent pre-confirmation is a pre-confirmation that you will give after like looking at all possible other options that you have and thinking, is this profitable for me or not? Whereas in an independent subslot auction, you're just thinking, does this help me increase the value of this subslot? Whereas in the dependent case, you're thinking about, how does it affect the value of the remaining subslots, and can it increase the value of the entire slot for me? So in the dependent subslot auction, that's what the people are buying. They're buying the right to gain the revenue from the remaining subslots. So it's sort of how a gateway would think about it. But yes, like implementing the dependent subset auction would require a very trusted auctioneer. But again, it's more of a modeling thing and a classification thing. How these things would be, how the dependent subset auctions would be implemented. I'm not even sure if they will be implemented. I think it's probably more likely that we would see a gateway than a dependent subset auction. But again, we would just need just to answer your question, we would need a really trusted auctioneer or a relayer.
Okay, thank you.
As preconfs, there might be a trend of them being delegated to builders or other specialized parties from proposers themselves.
Yep.
Are there any implementations to prevent short-term CR because you only have like such a centralized builder market anyways?
Yeah, I guess were you here for the pods talk?
No.
Okay, so yeah, like so I guess in some, depending on what time of the year it is, Suave at some points was this exact sort of thing where it was a censorship resistant input tape and then active builder that was potentially offering pre-confirmation. So yeah, like you would probably need to have some sort of external consensus committee that's basically providing your censorship resistance, but you would need the pre-confirmer to be committed to reading the input tape from that committee, which itself is a complex procedure. So the way Unichain is doing this is just by, I think it's by forcing the TEE to sign off on the output, which would be a way to do this. But again, you trust the TEE and you need to trust the censorship resistant committee. So yeah, the solutions that we currently have for having short-term censorship resistance with pre-confirmations is just like having a trusted external committee. So do with that what you will.
See, because like introducing slashing implementations or stuff for kind of these super builder or whatever concepts that are coming out seems like it'll introduce new forms of latency or other complexities that we probably don't want, right?
Well, slashing conditions are necessary. I'm not sure if you can introduce slashing conditions for censorship. That sounds like a very complex thing. I'm not sure if that's something that I'm not sure if it's something that's been done before. Like all of these L2s are running they're trusting their sequencer and that's it. There is no external committee that's like governing the censorship. Like you have the forced inclusion on L1, but that's just not the thing you're talking about. Like, so yeah, to be honest, it's definitely open area research and it's probably going to require some extra trust assumptions. So again, add another column to that table and just put something in black at the bottom.
Thank you.